June 28, 2024, the day the balance of power shifted in Venezuela. Let me tell you about the moment I realized we were witnessing something far bigger than another Latin American political crisis. It wasn't the headlines about Nicolas Maduro's latest crackdown, or the US State Department's routine condemnation, or even the European Union's half-hearted sanctions. No, it was the quiet, almost imperceptible movement of a Russian naval task force into the Caribbean, the sudden appearance of Chinese engineers in Venezuelan oil fields, and the way Washington's response wasn't outrage, but calculated silence. I've been tracking great power competition in the Western Hemisphere for over 2 decades, and what unfolded that week wasn't just another chapter in Venezuela's slow-motion collapse. It was the first real test of a new geopolitical order, one where the United States no longer dictates the rules unchallenged, where Russia and China don't just react to American pressure but preempt it, and where a failing petrostate like Venezuela suddenly becomes the linchpin of a much larger struggle. If you think this is just about democracy versus authoritarianism, you're missing the putt. This is about the end of an era. And here's the part they don't want you to: the US lost this round before it even began. The official what they want you to believe. The story, as it's being told, goes something like Venezuela is a humanitarian disaster, a dictatorship run by a corrupt strongman who rigs elections, jails opponents, and drives his people to starvation. The US, along with its European and Latin American allies, has imposed sanctions to pressure Maduro into holding free and fair elections, restoring democracy, and allowing international observers to monitor the process. The recent July 28 presidential vote was supposed to be the moment of truth. Either Maduro would finally face real competition, or the world would see him for the fraud he is. The official numbers, released by Venezuela's National Electoral Council, gave Maduro 51% of the vote, with opposition candidate Edmundo Gonzalez at 44%. The US immediately called the results not credible, the EU expressed serious concerns, and the Organization of American States demanded a full audit. The White House, in a carefully worded statement, declared that the Venezuelan people deserve a transparent process, while hinting at further sanctions if Maduro didn't comply. The media narrative followed: the Maduro steals another election, the US stands with the Venezuelan people, and the world waits to see if the regime will finally collapse under its own weight. It's a familiar story, one we've heard about Cuba, Nicaragua, and even Russia. And on the surface, it makes sense. After all, Venezuela's economy has shrunk by 75% since 2013, hyperinflation has wiped out savings, and over 7 million people have fled the country. If ever there was a moment for regime change, this should be it. But here's the problem with this: it assumes the US still has the leverage to make it happen. And it doesn't. Deconstructing what's really happening in Venezuela. Let's start with the most inconvenient: the sanctions aren't working. Not in the way Washington thinks, anyway. For years, the US has treated economic pressure as a magic wand: impose enough restrictions, and the regime will either collapse or negotiate. But Venezuela's economy didn't implode because of sanctions. It imploded because of decades of socialist mismanagement, corruption, and over-reliance on oil. The sanctions accelerated the decline, sure, but they didn't create it. And here's the Maduro has adapted. How? By doing what every smart authoritarian does when faced with economic strangulation: he diversified his patrons. In 2019, when the US recognized Juan Guaido as Venezuela's legitimate president and imposed a full oil embargo, Maduro didn't fold. Instead, he turned to Russia and China. Rosneft, Russia's state-owned oil giant, stepped in to buy Venezuelan crude at a discount, then resold it on the global market, effectively laundering it through third countries. China, meanwhile, kept the lights on with billions in loans, secured by future oil deliveries. The result? Venezuela's oil exports didn't disappear, they just changed hands. By 2023, Venezuela was producing around 800,000 barrels per day, up from a low of 350,000 in 2020. That's still a fraction of its peak, but it's enough to keep the regime afloat. And here's where it gets: the US knows this. In fact, the Biden administration quietly eased some sanctions in 2022, allowing Chevron to resume limited operations in Venezuela. Why? Because the US needed the oil. Because Europe was desperate for alternatives to Russian gas. And because, after years of trying to strangle Maduro, Washington realized it had no plan B. Now, let's talk about the election.
The opposition, led by Maria Corina Machado, coalesced around Edmundo Gonzalez, a little-known diplomat. Polls showed him leading Maduro by as much as 30 points. The regime, sensing danger, cracked down, arresting activists, blocking opposition rallies, and even detaining Machado's campaign staff. On election day, the CNE's results were met with immediate skepticism.
The opposition claimed it had evidence of fraud, including copies of tally sheets showing Gonzalez winning by a landslide.
But here's the part no one in the mainstream media is: if Maduro was so confident, why did he cheat? The answer is he wasn't confident. Not at all. The regime's internal polling showed the same thing as the opposition's: Gonzalez was winning. And Maduro, unlike his predecessor Hugo Chavez, doesn't have the charisma or the oil money to buy loyalty.
So he did what dictators do when he rigged the vote. But here's the: he didn't need to rig it as much as he did.
Because the real story isn't about the election, it's about what happens after.
The exted geopolitical why Venezuela matters more than you think.
Let me put this in perspective.
For the past 200 years, the United States has treated Latin America as its backyard. The Monroe Doctrine, the Roosevelt Corollary, the Cold War interventions, all of it was based on one simple: no foreign power gets to call the shots in the Western Hemisphere. And for most of that time, it worked. The British, the French, the Soviets, they all tried, and they all failed. But now, for the first time since the Cuban Missile Crisis, that assumption is being tested.
And the challengers aren't just Russia and China, they're coordinating. Let's start with Russia.
In the past year, Moscow has deepened its military ties with Venezuela in ways that should set off alarm bells in Washington. In February 2024, a Russian naval flotilla, including a nuclear-powered submarine, docked in La Guaira, just 20 miles from Caracas.
It wasn't an invasion, it was a message.
A reminder that if the US keeps pushing, Russia can push back.
And it's not just symbolic.
Venezuela is now the largest recipient of Russian arms in Latin America, with deliveries including Sukhoi fighter jets, T-72 tanks, and S-300 air defense systems. In 2023, Russia even sent military advisors to help train Venezuela's National Guard.
Then there's China.
Beijing has been playing the long game in Venezuela for over a decade, but in the past 2 years, its involvement has become strategic. In 2023, China's state-owned oil company, CNPC, signed a $3 billion deal to revive Venezuela's largest refinery, El Palito.
That same year, China's Exim Bank extended a $5 billion line of credit to Caracas, earmarked for infrastructure projects.
And in a move that should worry anyone paying attention, China has been quietly exiting its satellite tracking station in Venezuela, a facility that, according to U.S. intelligence, has dual-use capabilities for both civilian and military communications.
Now, here's where it gets really interesting. Russia and China aren't just propping up Maduro, they're reshaping the region's balance of power.
For Russia, Venezuela is a pressure plate. Every dollar Moscow spends in Caracas is a dollar that doesn't go to Ukraine.
Every Russian warship in the Caribbean is a distraction for the U.S. Navy.
And every time Washington condemns Maduro, it reinforces the narrative that the U.S. is still trying to dictate Latin America's future, a narrative that plays well in countries like Bolivia, Nicaragua, and even Mexico. For China, Venezuela is about resources and influence. The country sits on the world's largest proven oil reserves, 303 billion barrels, more than Saudi Arabia.
And while Venezuela's oil is heavy and expensive to refine, China has the technology and the appetite to process it.
More importantly, Beijing sees Venezuela as a beachhead in a region where the U.S. has historically dominated. If China can turn Venezuela into a reliable partner, it gains leverage over global energy markets, access to rare earth minerals, and a foothold in America's backyard.
And the U.S.? It's stuck. Because here's the cold, hard: the era of unipolarity is over.
For 30 years after the Cold War, the U.S. could impose its will with little resistance.
Sanctions worked because the global economy was integrated under American rules.
Military interventions were feasible because no one could challenge U.S. power projection.
But now,
Russia and China have built parallel financial systems, alternative trade networks, and military alliances that don't rely on Washington's approval. Venezuela is the first real test of this new multipolar world. And so far, the U.S. is losing.
Military and strategic. Why this isn't just another crisis. Let's talk about the military dimension, because this is where things get dangerous. The U.S. has a long history of military intervention in Latin America: Guatemala in 1954, Cuba in 1961, Chile in 1973, Grenada in 1983, MA in 1989. And in each case, the operation was quick, decisive, and successful. So why hasn't the U.S. just invaded Venezuela? 2. Russia and China. In 2019, when the Trump administration was openly discussing military options, Russia sent 2 nuclear-capable bombers to Venezuela. The message was, if you invade, we respond. And it worked. The U.S. backed off. Now, fast forward to 2024. The U.S. Southern Command has been conducting routine naval exercises in the Caribbean, but the real action is happening in the shadows. According to leaked intelligence reports, Russia has pre-positioned military equipment in Venezuela, including anti-ship missiles and air defense systems. China, meanwhile, has been exiting its satellite tracking station, which could be used to monitor U.S. naval movements in the region. Here's the nightmare: a U.S. military intervention in Venezuela triggers a Russian or Chinese response. Maybe it's cyber attacks on U.S. infrastructure. Maybe it's a naval blockade of Taiwan. Maybe it's a sudden escalation in Ukraine. And suddenly, what was supposed to be a quick regime change operation turns into a global crisis. Now, I'm not saying this is likely. But I am saying that the risk of miscalculation is higher than at any point since the Cuban Missile Crisis. And here's the part that should keep policymakers up: the U.S. public isn't ready for this. For decades, Americans have been told that military interventions are quick, clean, and consequence-free. Iraq was supposed to be a cakewalk. Libya was supposed to be a humanitarian mission. Afghanistan was supposed to be about nation building. And in every case, the reality was a quagmire. Venezuela would be no different. The country is twice the size of Iraq, with a population that's deeply divided, a military that's loyal to Maduro, and a geography that's perfect for guerrilla warfare. And yet, there are still voices in Washington, mostly on the right, but some on the left, who think a military solution is viable. They're wrong. And if they get their way, we could be looking at another forever war, this time in America's own backyard. The domestic political: why Venezuela is a distraction. Now, let's talk about the one factor that's often overlooked in geopolitical domestic politics. For the Biden administration, Venezuela is a political liability. On one hand, the White House needs to appear tough on Maduro to satisfy the Cuban American and Venezuelan American communities in Florida, a critical swing state. On the other hand, the U.S. needs Venezuelan oil to keep gas prices down ahead of the 2024 election. And then there's the humanitarian crisis: over 7 million Venezuelan refugees have fled to Colombia, Peru, and the U.S., creating a migration surge that's become a major political issue. So what's the administration's play? Muddle through. They've imposed targeted sanctions on Maduro's inner circle, but they've also allowed Chevron to keep pumping oil. They've condemned the election as fraudulent, but they haven't recognized Gonzales as the legitimate president. They've talked about restoring democracy, but they've also signaled that they're open to negotiations. Why? Because the alternative, military intervention or a full economic blockade, is political suicide. The American public is war-weary. The economy is fragile. And the last thing Biden needs is another foreign policy crisis in an election year. But here's this half-measure approach isn't working. Maduro isn't backing down. The opposition is fractured. And Russia and China are digging in. So what happens next? That depends on who wins in November. If Trump returns to the White House, we could see a return to the maximum pressure strategy: more sanctions, more covert operations, and a higher risk of military confrontation. If Biden wins, we'll likely see more of the symbolic gestures with no real teeth. Either way, the U.S. is trapped. Because the truth is, no one in Washington actually has a plan for Venezuela. They're just hoping the problem goes away. Scenario: what comes next? So where does this go from here? Let me lay out the 3 most likely scenarios, along with their probabilities. Scenario 1: the frozen conflict.
In this scenario, Venezuela becomes a permanent crisis, not a failed state, but not a functioning democracy either. Maduro holds onto power through a mix of repression, patronage, and foreign support.
The US imposes more sanctions, but Russia and China keep the regime afloat.
The opposition remains divided, and the country's economic decline continues, albeit at a slower pace. This is the North Korea model, a pariah state that survives because no one has the stomach to force regime change.
Scenario 2, the negotiated transition. Here, the US and its allies finally realize that sanctions aren't working and that military intervention is too risky. They cut a deal with amnesty for him and his inner circle in exchange for a power-sharing agreement with the opposition. This is the South Africa model, a messy, imperfect transition that avoids civil war. The problem? Maduro has no incentive to negotiate unless he's facing an existential threat. And right now, he isn't. Scenario 3, the collapse. This is the worst-case scenario. The economy implodes. The military fractures. Maduro is overthrown in a coup, but the country descends into chaos. Russia and China pull their support, leaving Venezuela to fend for itself. Millions more flee, destabilizing the region. And the US is forced to either intervene militarily or watch as a narco-state emerges on its doorstep. This is the Libya model, and no one wins. Now, let me be none of these scenarios are good. But the most likely outcome, the frozen conflict, is also the most dangerous, because it normalizes a new geopolitical world where the US can no longer dictate outcomes in its own hemisphere. Grand strategy: the death of liberal hegemony. This brings me to the bigger picture. What's happening in Venezuela isn't just about Venezuela. It's about the end of an era. For the past 30 years, the US has pursued a grand strategy of liberal hegemony, the idea that America should use its unrivaled power to spread democracy, free markets, and human rights around the world. And for a while, it worked. The Soviet Union collapsed. China opened up. Globalization lifted millions out of poverty. But then came Iraq. And Afghanistan. And Libya. And Syria. And now, Ukraine. And in each case, the US overreached. It assumed that military power could reshape societies. It assumed that economic sanctions could force compliance. It assumed that the world would always bend to American will. And it was wrong. Venezuela is the latest example of this failure. The US tried to isolate Maduro. It tried to starve his regime. It tried to rally the international community against him. And yet, he's still in power. Not because he's strong, but because the world has changed. Russia and China have learned from America's mistakes. They don't try to impose their values. They don't invade countries to spread democracy. They co-opt elites. They buy influence. They exploit divisions. And in a multipolar world, that's a winning strategy. The US, meanwhile, is still playing by the old rules. It assumes that sanctions will work. It assumes that military power is decisive. It assumes that the world will always choose America over its rivals. And it's losing. This isn't just about Venezuela. It's about Taiwan. It's about Ukraine. It's about the Middle East. The US is still the world's most powerful country, but it's no longer the only powerful country. And if Washington doesn't adapt, it's going to keep losing one crisis at a time. Alternatives and the return of spheres of influence. Now, what most people don't realize is that the US foreign policy establishment still hasn't accepted that the era of liberal hegemony is over. They keep trying to revive it, like a doctor administering CPR to a patient who's been dead for years. The latest attempt is the rules-based international order narrative, a phrase so vague it could mean anything, yet so sanctimonious that anyone who questions it is immediately branded a rogue state. But here's the uncomfortable: the rules-based order was never as universal as Washington claimed. It was always an American order, enforced by American power, and when that power wanes, so does the order. Let me explain why this matters for Venezuela. The US has spent the last 2 decades treating Latin America as its backyard,
a region where it could intervene at will, overthrow governments, and install compliant regimes.
But that era is ending. Russia and China have been quietly rewriting the rules of engagement in the Western Hemisphere, and they're doing it without firing a shot.
In 2019, when the U.S. recognized Juan Guaido as Venezuela's interim president, Russia sent military advisors to Caracas. Not to fight, but to if the U.S. tries to remove Maduro by force, Moscow will respond. China, meanwhile, has extended billions in loans to Venezuela, secured by oil, and has become the regime's financial lifeline.
These aren't acts of charity.
They're investments in a new balance of power.
And it's not just Venezuela.
Look at Nicaragua, where Russia has reopened a Cold War-era military base.
Or Cuba, where China is extending its intelligence and cyber capabilities.
Or Brazil, where Beijing has become the largest trading partner, displacing the U.S. in a country that was once Washington's closest ally in the region. The U.S. still has military dominance, no one is contesting that, but military dominance alone doesn't win geopolitical struggles. What wins is influence, and influence is built on economic ties, diplomatic leverage, and the ability to offer alternatives.
Here's where the military implications become critical.
The U.S. Southern Command has spent the last decade warning about the threat of Russian and Chinese presence in Latin America, but these warnings have been dismissed as alarmist.
That's a mistake. Russia and China aren't trying to invade the U.S.
They're not even trying to challenge American military supremacy directly.
What they're doing is far more, they're eroding the U.S. ability to project power in its own hemisphere.
Take the case of the Russian Wagner Group in Venezuela.
In 2020, reports emerged that Wagner mercenaries were training Venezuelan forces and providing security for Maduro.
The U.S. responded with sanctions, but the damage was already done.
Wagner's presence wasn't about defending Venezuela, it was about creating a precedent. If the U.S. can use private military contractors in Iraq and Syria, why can't Russia do the same in Venezuela? If the U.S. can arm rebels in Libya, why can't China sell weapons to Nicaragua?
The rules are being rewritten, and the U.S. isn't the one holding the pen.
Now, let's talk about the Monroe Doctrine.
For 2 centuries, the U.S. has treated Latin America as its exclusive sphere of influence.
But the Monroe Doctrine was always a product of American power, not international law.
When the U.S. was the only game in town, it could enforce it.
But in a multipolar world, the doctrine is a relic. Russia and China don't recognize it, and neither do an increasing number of Latin American governments. In 2022, Mexican President Andrés Manuel López Obrador declared that the Monroe Doctrine was dead, and he wasn't wrong. The question isn't whether the doctrine is dead, it's whether the U.S. can accept that reality.
The military implications of this shift are profound. The U.S. has spent the last 30 years fighting wars in the Middle East, assuming that its dominance in Latin America was permanent.
But while Washington was distracted, its adversaries were making inroads. Russia and China don't need to build military bases in Latin America to challenge U.S. influence.
They just need to make it too costly for the U.S. to intervene.
And that's exactly what they're doing. Consider the case of Ecuador.
In 2023, the U.S. pressured the Ecuadorian government to crack down on Chinese fishing vessels operating in its waters. The U.S. framed this as a fight against illegal fishing, but the real issue was geopolitical. China's fishing fleet is a tool of soft power, it provides jobs, it secures resources, and it gives Beijing leverage. The U.S. tried to rally Latin American countries against China, but it failed.
Why? Because China offers something the U.S. doesn't: investment without lectures on democracy. This is the new reality.
The U.S. can still deploy its military, but it can no longer dictate the terms of engagement. In Venezuela, the U.S. could invade tomorrow, but it would face a protracted insurgency, backed by Russia and China, in a country that's already a failed state.
The costs would be astronomical, and the benefits would be minimal. That's not a recipe for victory, it's a recipe for quagmire.
So where does this leave us? The U.S. has 2 options. The first is to double down on the old strategy, to keep trying to isolate Venezuela, to keep imposing sanctions, to keep pretending that the world still bends to American will. That's the path of least resistance, but it's also the path to irrelevance. The second option is to adapt, to recognize that the era of liberal hegemony is over and that a new balance of power is emerging.
That means accepting that Russia and China will have influence in Latin America, just as the US has influence in Eastern Europe and the Middle East. It means competing, not through military intervention, but through economic engagement, diplomatic creativity, and a willingness to offer real alternatives. The problem is that the US foreign policy establishment is still trapped in the 1990s. It still believes that America's unipolar moment can be revived. It still thinks that sanctions and military power are the keys to global dominance.
But the world has moved on.
The question isn't whether the US can turn back the clock, it's whether it can adapt before it's too late.
Venezuela is just the beginning. The real test will come when the next crisis hits, whether it's in Taiwan, Ukraine, or the South China Sea.
If the US doesn't change its approach, it's going to keep losing. And in a multipolar world, losing isn't an option. It's a one-way ticket to decline. Now, what most people don't realize is that this geopolitical shift in Venezuela isn't just about external actors, it's also about the internal dynamics that have been simmering for years. The establishment narrative in Washington still treats Maduro as a temporary nuisance, a dictator clinging to power through sheer brutality, as if his regime were some kind of aberration rather than a structural feature of Venezuela's political economy. But that's a dangerous oversimplification. The reality is that Maduro's survival isn't just about repression, it's about the fragmentation of the opposition, the exhaustion of the population, and the fact that, for all its failures, Chavismo has left an indelible mark on Venezuelan society. Let me explain why this matters. The opposition in Venezuela isn't what it was in 2019, when Juan Guaidó was hailed as the country's legitimate president by over 50 nations. Back then, there was a sense of momentum, a belief that the regime was on the brink of collapse, that a combination of sanctions, international pressure, and domestic unrest would force Maduro out. But that moment passed, and with it, the illusion of a unified opposition. Today, the anti-Chavista coalition is fractured, with factions divided over strategy, leadership, and even whether to participate in elections. The 2024 presidential election is a perfect example. The opposition's primary in October 2023 was a rare moment of unity, with Maria Corina Machado winning in a landslide, but the regime has since disqualified her from running, just as it did with Enrique Capriles in 2013 and Leopoldo Lopez before him. The message is the government will not allow a viable challenger to emerge. Here's the uncomfortable: Maduro's regime has outmaneuvered the opposition not just through force, but through institutional manipulation. The Supreme Tribunal of Justice, packed with loyalists, has systematically dismantled the opposition's ability to compete. The National Electoral Council, controlled by Chavistas, has gerrymandered districts, disqualified candidates, and created a playing field so uneven that even if the opposition were to win, the results would be contested. And let's not forget the role of the military. The armed forces in Venezuela aren't just a tool of repression, they're a political actor in their own right, with generals holding key positions in the government, the oil industry, and even the food distribution networks. The 2018 assassination attempt against Maduro, allegedly carried out with drones, was a wake-up call for the regime. Since then, it has doubled down on its control over the military, purging dissidents and rewarding loyalty with lucrative contracts and immunity from prosecution. But here's where it gets even more complicated. The opposition's weakness isn't just a product of repression, it's also a product of its own failures. For years, the anti-Chavista movement has been divided between those who advocate for negotiation and those who insist on regime change. The 2021 Barbados talks, mediated by Norway, were a prime example. The opposition entered the negotiations with high hopes, only to see the government walk away when it became clear that the US wasn't willing to lift sanctions without major concessions. The result? A fractured opposition, a disillusioned electorate, and a regime that has learned to play the long game. Now, let's talk about the economy, because that's where the real story lies. Venezuela's collapse wasn't inevitable, it was the result of decades of mismanagement, corruption, and ideological dogmatism. But what's fascinating is how the regime has adapted to survive. The hyperinflation of 2018 to 2019, which peaked at over 1 million%, was a disaster for ordinary Venezuelans, but it also created opportunities for those with access to dollars.
The government's partial dollarization in 2020 was a tacit admission that the bolivar was worthless, but it also allowed the regime to stabilize the economy just enough to avoid total collapse. Today, Venezuela's GDP is still less than a third of what it was in 2013, but the worst of the hyperinflation is over. The economy is now a bizarre hybrid of state control and informal dollarization, where the government still sets prices for basic goods but where most transactions happen in cash or through digital payments in US dollars. This is where the geopolitical and domestic dimensions intersect. The regime's survival isn't just about repression, it's about creating a new economic model that allows it to maintain power while avoiding total isolation. The partial lifting of U.S. sanctions in 2023, which allowed Chevron to resume limited oil production, was a sign that Washington is starting to recognize this reality. The Biden administration has been careful not to frame it as a concession to Maduro officially. It's about alleviating suffering and creating space for negotiations, but the message is the U.S. is no longer demanding regime change as a precondition for engagement. This is a major shift, and it's one that the opposition has struggled to adapt to. Maria Corina Machado, for all her popularity, has been critical of the U.S. approach, arguing that sanctions relief only strengthens the regime. But the reality is that the opposition is running out of options. The 2024 election is shaping up to be a farce, with the government already signaling that it won't allow Machado to run. The question is whether the opposition will participate in a process it knows is rigged, or whether it will boycott and risk further marginalization. Here's the regime isn't invincible. The protests of 2017 and 2019 showed that Venezuelans are still willing to take to the streets, even at great personal risk. But the government has learned from those experiences. It has refined its tactics, using a combination of targeted repression, co-optation, and divide-and-rule strategies to keep the opposition off balance. The recent arrest of opposition figures like Roland Carreño and the harassment of Machado's campaign team are signs that the regime is preparing for a crackdown. But it's also a sign of weakness. A government that feels secure doesn't need to arrest its opponents, it can afford to ignore them. So where does this leave Venezuela in the coming years? The most likely scenario is a continuation of the status quo, a hybrid regime that combines authoritarianism with a veneer of electoral legitimacy, propped up by oil revenues, Chinese and Russian support, and a fragmented opposition. The 2024 election will be neither free nor fair, but it will give the regime a patina of democratic legitimacy, which it will use to argue that sanctions should be lifted. The US and Europe will face a do they recognize the results, even if they're flawed, or do they double down on isolation? My bet is that they'll choose the former, because the alternative, total collapse, is too risky. But there's another scenario, one that's less discussed but far more dangerous. What if the regime's economic stabilization efforts fail? What if oil prices crash, or if the US reimposes sanctions? Venezuela's economy is still incredibly fragile. The government has managed to stabilize the bolivar, but it's done so by printing money and relying on dollar inflows from remittances and oil exports. If those inflows dry up, the country could plunge back into hyperinflation. And if that happens, all bets are off. The military, which has so far remained loyal, might start to fracture. The opposition, which has been weakened by infighting, could see a resurgence. And the geopolitical players, Russia, China, the US, would be forced to recalculate their strategies. The uncomfortable truth is that Venezuela is no longer just a domestic crisis, it's a geopolitical battleground. The regime's survival isn't just about Maduro's grip on power, it's about the broader struggle for influence in Latin America. And that's why the US can't afford to ignore it. The old playbook, sanctions, isolation, regime change, has failed. The new playbook has to be more nuanced. It has to recognize that Venezuela is a country of 28 million people, not a pawn in a great power game. And it has to accept that the only way out of this crisis is through negotiation, not confrontation. But here's the negotiation requires leverage, and the US has squandered much of its leverage by refusing to engage. The Biden administration's decision to ease sanctions was a step in the right direction, but it was too little, too late. The regime has already adapted, and the opposition is weaker than it's been in years. The window for meaningful change is closing, and if the US doesn't act soon, it may find itself with no good options left. The real tragedy is that Venezuela's crisis was never just about Maduro. It was about the failure of a political and economic model that promised prosperity but delivered collapse. And until the international community and the Venezuelan people themselves grapple with that reality, the country will remain trapped in this cycle of crisis and stagnation.
The new balance of power in Venezuela isn't just about who controls the oil or who sits in the presidential palace.
It's about whether the country can break free from the patterns of the past and forge a new path forward.
And right now, that future looks more uncertain than ever.